insurance.
And she probably was texting or talking on the phone.
Oh, that's what they do.
Did you get
So
her?
both my insurance, I went to the police department yesterday because I thought maybe they had lights, cameras
I don't know.
at that corner, which they didn't, unfortunately.
Did you get
But
your,
they-
did you get the license plates of the car?
No, I couldn't see them.
Uh,
And I couldn't even get out of my car because she was right next to the driver's seat in her car.
Did she hit your car?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
So she hit me and left me with a $500 deductible. Oh, I was so mad.
I don't blame you.
So I went to the police department yesterday. They said this is happening more and more. And my insurance agents told me the same thing.
if they have cameras
Said
in that
people don't,
intersection.
they don't at that corner, I checked.
Well,
She said that they're not getting insurance,
that's right.
so they're running off.
What they're doing is when they get their license, they get insurance, a certain kind of insurance, you get temporary insurance. And as soon as they get their license, they cancel it.
Cancel it.
Yeah, but these accidents would not
That's what
happen
they
if
have.
people were not living.
They,
Exactly, that's what she must have been doing. I can't, and because she made absolutely no effort to stop her car. So she wasn't even looking that she was doing
and
this.
picked up some bruises,
I'm looking at the
bruises.
theater tomorrow, there's stuff
I
in the
picked up the
city,
vehicles.
look in
We got,
Freeman?
Freeman.
Where did you find the coffee?
Yeah, wow, what is that?
it's right back there.
Good
was it?
something.
Yes,
I thought you have to have insurance.
I'm too glad it doesn't have teeth.
You know what I
Don't
want?
worry.
I'm looking for the sofa.
Yeah, which is why, but since I was first one in the room,
Which was a remake
the thing was
of a
empty.
movie that you're too young to remember.
I
Well,
don't
thank you
see
for picking it.
It's a war movie.
Okay.
And the green cheese.
What's in it?
I like the garden,
Nobody-
garden veggie.
Oh,
That's a good addition.
I think it might have been made in Germany.
No,
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I might have seen it years ago.
Maybe
I used to love to watch
It may be early,
It's a.
but it looks like I'm looking at the Temple-Tifereth April,
Yeah.
and they're not really showing the schedule for Rabbi Klein's last three, unless they're not going to do it.
I think she did.
Okay, well, maybe it was too early when they published
I
it,
got some
so I'll watch.
I got their
I think it was already,
on pita bread.
Well, that must be something new. I don't remember that on there.
Well, let me tell you, I thought I was going to have 2 pieces steak at the restaurant.
You ate the whole thing.
It was so good.
I gotta go get one.
Oh my God. You know, it's at Latins on Sunset.
Fairmont Cedar?
No.
No, the other one?
Yeah, it's near me.
Yeah. Oh, out your way there's one.
Yeah.
Where?
we have a very small class today.
What time is it?
Like I said, I have a feeling something
It's,
it has to do with the
It's
impending
Wilson Mills and
flood.
Science Center. I know this shopping
What,
center.
I just heard about the wind this
Good morning.
Well, we had a downpour in the middle of the night.
Yes.
What's the matter? What's the matter?
It was short,
I gave my
but
deal away.
That was-
What?
for Cleveland,
Yes.
for Cleveland, it came down
You're
a lot.
mad.
There's supposed to be a lot of wind this afternoon.
Yeah, that,
I gave mine away.
I have about 5 of them if you need one.
Do we
I
need
need-
2 days a week?
They keep coming.
yeah. I
This
believe
is a
it.
good one because it's not so big
Because I'm
and
scheduled
it doesn't, it's not wide.
maybe
I
it's
can
the
put a photo.
15th, and I think that's the last day of basic.
Yeah, very nice.
You gotta talk to,
Took arrested.
This is the second side.
I
I
think,
woke up at 5.
I woke up at 2:30.
Oh,
And I couldn't go back to sleep, so I read for 2.5 hours.
I do that occasionally.
But the wind back in the wind in the
I don't know.
morning, the other day, sitting
I
down.
think it ends around either the 12th or the 13th is when
Oh,
it
is
was.
that
I must have
Yeah.
dozed between 6
So
and
that
7
by extra then.
Oh,
because I looked at the clock, it was 6 and I was still up and then it was 7.
How did it go?
I sent you an email. I don't know if you got
When
it.
did you send it?
Yesterday.
Oh, yeah, I did. I didn't get into my computer yesterday. Yeah.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. I'm looking forward to your lecture on the
But,
tutors. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thursday the 13th.
How are you? Good, how are you?
Looks like we're all gonna get blown away on it when we leave.
I want some sunshine, it's too much like this.
Sun is up there still.
Do you have reliable sources too?
No, I do not. We don't know what kind of deal we're working on here.
And still people don't believe in global.
The troops are here.
Good morning.
Before 11, or I will bring it to her.
Good morning. Gershon. Morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Yeah, heart surgery next week.
You are?
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
Do it up.
Yeah, you were nervous. Okay, you and I thought.
Pardon?
Well, I see it riskly, you're not straight. You were walking. Yes, really. I like to see it.
I was even seeing that.
You look good to be present.
Yeah, okay.
10:30, I don't know.
State of Ohio pretty much says this is what you will teach.
That's what I did. I just wasn't pretty. No, that's what it
Because I can't sleep for the other two.
And then, I'm reading the book club book. Call Me America. It's so good. It's not till after Passover. We'll be able to read this, more than halfway
I don't know about
through. What did she get?
that was always the notion. There were a lot of
Well, I would, I'm halfway through.
Just kind of, I guess, like we're
File
just
section.
no, it's not there.
Some of
I'm
that
not sure if I'll bring it to him. He knows where you live.
Yeah, right.
But now, it says she can come over before 11, so I don't know if he's not gonna be there before 11. Yeah, he's
deal is, there are certain classes,
well, I said, could you bring it? It's just right now.
That's what I said. Everybody were better than I do.
So what time?
my stories.
Because I gave you but it's at 11:15, so you cannot be at 6.
Do I do what? Yes, I do. I do use CC.
No, but whatever.
It's not like it was.
That's right. Why am I having? And you mean the mirror?
4 chapters on contact law.
You're right there, but you start.
Yes,
One chapter actually about
I have selfish I would not you know, every once in a while, completely he does the wife.
and what
I know, it's so big. But, yeah, so what is your emphasis?
I have found a good pleasure actually my children and
Yeah.
and what's really interesting is watching some of the law books. They don't have as such. Sometimes, in fact, they have the same law for television. Sometimes they
I would go and everyone takes notes. So,
tea bag too soon. Julie, how are you doing? I'm okay. Doris is gorgeous. It's another group. Somebody else came up. So we'll see. So you're now doing the food. I did the next, the day following, I did the real people respond. And it's I told them that there was an exercise. They were picked up
With my,
No, the end of the show is actually, that's when they come, because they are afraid that they are missing. I would think April and Tuesdays are the big days, because
I still like, I tell you,
and the members get a free. So Tuesdays are the
doing a
ones
play on our
that,
daughter.
it's taste, it's funny.
so I don't not a Tuesday, preferably. I think that
Stairway to Heaven is
on the weekend,
Torah.
I would think Wednesday,
Waive the laws,
something like that.
so I just say,
They want to go to see her Tuesday.
I have all the
Maybe in
This guy's the first Just be sure it feels like. Yeah, he doesn't start that yet. But he gets what I don't remember. Well, the first one there is none, the second one there is none, the third one there is none, so the fourth one there is Probably, but I don't know that it was a well-designed show. To me, it was just not cogent that if you dynasty, then it starts from A and goes to B. Or C. Well, the first one is the candelabra with the angels.
Morning. Getting any responses?
The rabbi didn't answer, so what can I expect?
What's that?
I said, the rabbi didn't respond, so what can I expect?
I'll send out a bulletin to everybody.
I'm giving you some. No, actually, Doris said that Doris goes with another group. Amy said that she would like to join my regular group. Rory said that she's starting. She said that she's starting. No, just
No.
other than that, Oh, I thought it, yeah.
Good morning, everybody. Shabbat Shalom. Okay. Good to see all of you, and welcome to those who are live streaming as well. A couple of people have reminded me that I need to repeat the questions. You would think that is not going to be that hard. But once I get involved in the conversation, it's hard for me to think of anything else. So that's what I'm going to do. I apologize to those of you who are live streaming that I don't do that. I'm going to try. Okay, so next Saturday, Patty London is going to lead Torah Study, and thanks, Patty, for doing that. Patty said to me she already has a plan. So, but we won't divulge it now so people can come to find out. Don't you remember those book reviews we did in elementary school where we said, I'm not going to give you the ending. If you want to find it out, read it yourself. So, good, but thanks so much for doing that. Okay, so as you know, Cindy Wilson's husband, Leroy, passed away. We had the funeral yesterday, and she's been out all week, so I don't have the list of those who sponsored bagels and live streaming, and I suppose you don't know either because you sign up and then don't remember it anymore.
There's a sign on the table.
There is? Excellent. What does the sign say?
It says, "Pay through the generosity of Eileen and Gary Cameron." That was last week, you know? Yes, thank you.
To whom now again?
Eileen and Gary.
Eileen and Gary Kammer. That was last week, but thank you so much for last week. Who picked up the bagels this morning? Okay, Sid, thank you so much for doing that. And when Cindy returns this week, I will find out who sponsored the bagels and the live streaming. Always very glad and impressed that this runs so very smoothly. Okay, so let's continue with our blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We praise you, Lord our God, sovereign of the universe, who sanctifies us through God's commandments and joining upon us the obligation to immerse ourselves in words of Torah. Amen. Does everybody have a sheet? So first we're going to look at the text itself, but I do want to explore this controversy between Maimonides and Nachmanides on the meaning of sacrifice, a very famous controversy, and I think very revealing of two different kinds of views of these things. Remember, a couple of weeks ago, we looked at Nachmanides and Rashi on the order of the chapters and where does the building of the tabernacle and where does the golden calf episode belong. So that, I think, was also fascinating. So what we're doing now is going to somewhat quickly, finish the book of Exodus. The Torah portion for this week is Vayikra, the first portion of the book of Leviticus. As I said on a number of occasions, we are more or less committed to being with the Jewish people on the Torah portion of the week. We're not going to be slavish to it, but it's good to try to maintain some momentum here and do as much as we can. So let's look at the very end of the book of Exodus, chapter 40. Which is, according to some commentators, a prelude to what happens in the book of Leviticus. So this view is not that we have two separate books, but we have one continuous kind of narrative. So chapter 40, verse 17. In the first month of the second year, on the first of the month, already we have something interesting. This is New Year's Day, first month of the second year from the Exodus from Egypt on the first of the month. New Year's Day, Rosh Hashanah, for example, reflects the idea of a new creation, the creation of the world. So we might infer from this, as scholars have, that the idea that this it happens on a New Year's Day suggests a correspondence between the creation of two worlds. The creation of the universe by God in Genesis chapter 1, and the creation of another kind of world, kind of universe, the Mishkan, the tabernacle in the wilderness, which is, as we know from looking at the illustration of the structure of the Mishkan, is very brilliantly and profoundly ordered. What we have here is the creation in priestly terms of the covenant between God and the people. The Mishkan functions in two ways: as an oraculum, a place where one receives messages, oracles from God, in the Holy of Holies, right above the ark, where God, between the two cheruvim, whose outstretched wings encloses space right over the ark, where God comes to speak with Moses and by implication with the people. And in the outer court, a parallel square, we have the cult. We have the sacrificial altar at which the people offer their sacrifices to God. And that altar faces the Holy of Holies. So when the people sacrifice to God, it is clear that those sacrifices are meant to echo, to come to God. So we have God's presence and we have the people's presence. God speaking to the people speaking to God, which creates a kind of world, a universe of order through which the people can relate to God on their journeys throughout history. And you can see the very last verse of Exodus. For over the tabernacle a cloud of the Lord rested by day, and fire would appear in it by night, in view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys. Okay? So as the people journey forward from Mount Sinai with the tabernacle taken down and erected, the people have a kind of portable Sinai with them, a way in which to communicate with God, initiated by the people and initiated by God. So in this sense, the book of Genesis and the book of Exodus are complementary. And the end of Exodus reminds us of the beginning of Genesis. If you remember Nachmanides' preface to the book of Exodus, which I didn't bring, Nachmanides asks the question, when does the liberation from Egypt finally reach its climax and culmination? And his answer is, neither in the physical departure from Egypt, nor in the arrival at Sinai to receive the Ten Commandments, But at the end of the book of Exodus, when God moves back in with the people, the reconciliation or the coming together through the tabernacle of God's presence in history. So for Nachmanides, we have to come to the end of Exodus until we get the fullness of the liberation. Of course, Nachmanides does not disagree that there are other modes of liberation, the departure from Egypt physically, the arrival at Mount Sinai, but his question is, if Exodus is the book of liberation, we have to account for 16 of the 40 chapters in the book of Exodus. That's from chapter 25 through 40. If it's the book of liberation, you can't ignore all of those chapters, and therefore they must have something to do with the liberation from Egypt. And since they're the climactic chapters, it would be the climactic moment of liberation, which is in and through the ritual. Okay? So back here to chapter 40. In the first month of the second year, on the first of the month, the tabernacle was set up. Moses set up the tabernacle, placing its sockets, setting up its planks, inserting its bars, and erecting its posts. He spread the tent over the tabernacle, placing the covering of the tent on top of it, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. And that underlines the difference between building a certain structure and not building another. Building the tabernacle is valid because it's in response to God's command. Building the golden calf, another kind of building, is invalid because the impetus doesn't come from above, it comes from below. It doesn't come from God, it comes from people's needs. Okay? So just as the Lord commanded Moses underlines that point. He took the pact, verse 20, and placed it in the ark. He fixed the poles to the ark, placed the cover on top of it, brought the ark inside the tabernacle. Then he put up the curtain for the screening and screened off the ark of the pact, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Skipping to verse 27. On it he burned aromatic incense, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. And then verses 28 through 33 continue this process of construction. Let's look at verse 32. They washed when they entered the tent of meeting and when they approached the altar, as the Lord had commanded Moses. The reiteration of this point which offers validation of this effort. Why does it need validation? Because the building of religious structures is, in a way, a very dangerous enterprise. What makes us think we can enclose God in a structure? Or we can decide how God, if God is transcendent, is going to come down and interact with the people. Those would seem to be kinds of actions that go beyond human humility, to arrogate to ourselves the behavior of God, when and where. So it had better be authorized by God in order for it to be valid. And that's what we see over and over here. So, verse 33, in my Bible, we have a new paragraph right in the middle of 33. When Moses had finished the work, the cloud covered, by the way, the Hebrew, Vaychal Moshe et hamlacha, reminds us of Genesis chapter 2, Vayachulu Hashemayim, when they had finished the building of or when God had finished the creation of the world. So this word Vayachal is an echo of the same idea at the end of the creation of the world by God. Just another connection between these two enterprises, brackets, we might say, of the Genesis-Exodus combination. When Moses had finished the work, the cloud covered the tent of meeting. The word for cloud in Hebrew is kavod, kavod Adonai, the glory, the essence, the presence, the majesty. So the cloud represents God's immanence. And remember, there are two ways of spelling immanence, related to time and related to space. I-M-M-I-N is related to time. Something will happen imminently. Whereas immanence, I-M-M-A-N, relates to space, the nearness of God. The immanence, I-M-M-A-N, reflects the possibility that God is near. And all of the details of the building of the Mishkan are a way of assuring that what we've done here by building the Mishkan is valid, and God will understand that and come down when God needs to. When Moses, back to 33b, the second half of 33, when Moses had finished the work, the cloud covered the tent of meeting. It's God's Amen. You built the Mishkan, Amen. I'm in. I'm coming down. But of course, the author of the Torah uses indirection for the presence of God. God is to be found in something like a cloud, okay? So cloud is a cloud, fire. These are realities, but they have no substantiality, so they're good metaphors for the presence of God. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the presence of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled upon it, and the presence of the Lord filled the tabernacle. When the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites would set out on their various journeys, but if the cloud did not lift, they would not set out until such a time as it did lift. Okay? So God's immanence does not compromise God's transcendence or utter freedom. Just because God comes down to dwell temporarily in the Mishkan doesn't mean we now control God. God's going to decide when the cloud is lifted and when the cloud comes down. 4, verse 38, over the tabernacle, a cloud of the Lord rested by day, and fire would appear in it by night, in the view of all the house of Israel throughout their journeys. Okay? A really, I think, quite spectacular conclusion. We have kind of the end, if I can put it this way, the end of the movie when everything turns out fine. Now, we know that is only temporarily the case because there are going to be problems. I remember something, and I've mentioned this over the years, but I will not forget it. Something Bill Joseph of blessed memory once did. He sent me a New Yorker cartoon where a priest or a minister is declaiming from the podium. And on the 8th day, God said, "Let there be problems." And there were problems. So it looks great here, and every now and then we have a kind of climactic moment of peace, pacification, rest, but things will change. Now, so what's the situation? God is filling the tent of meeting, the Holy of Holies. By the way, it just occurred to me to say something about, in verse 35, this word tent, this phrase tent of meeting, Ohel Moed. Remember last week when we looked at Moses' attempt to mollify God after the golden calf incident, that he would take his tent, the tent of meeting, and go outside the camp in order to have conversation with God. And that tent of meeting had no sacrificial priestly activities. It was a place where Moses would meet God. So that's very different from the use of the tent of meeting here. Here it's a synonym for the Mishkan, for the tabernacle, which has two names: Mishkan, tent of meeting. Or, as we might say, it is a combination of two traditions about the tabernacle. One tradition has featured the language of the tent of meeting. Another tradition has featured the language of Mishkan, and at some point an editor combined them. What gives us some evidence about this? The very fact that in Exodus chapter 33, we have a very different understanding of tent of meeting, which is very different from the Mishkan, which may be, in terms of chronology, prior to the understanding of the tabernacle, which seems much more elaborate, much more priestly. The tent of meeting of Moses outside the camp seems a bit more primitive and private. So we might think that there were two separate traditions for which we have a piece of evidence, though it's not conclusive. And at some point, what happened in Exodus 33 was combined with the tabernacle theology in order to, how would I finish that sentence? In order possibly to marginalize Moses' tent of meeting, to combine it, and therefore to combine the two authorities of two different ways of understanding God's immanence. In any event, I think it's interesting in verse 35 that we have that other use of the tent of meeting. Okay, so where are we? God has filled the tent. Moses can't get in. Now that's a mini crisis, isn't it? Unless Moses can get in, there can be no communication from God to the people through Moses. So if we turn the page to Leviticus, we find something very interesting. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him. This is a redundancy, isn't it? The Lord called Moses and said, speak to the people, or the Lord spoke to Moses, speak to the people. We have two verbs of God addressing Moses. Vayikra el Moshe, he called to Moses. Vayedaber Adonai elav, and he spoke to him. So what are we to make of this? Definitively, I don't know. But one way of looking at it is that the first calling comes from inside the tent of the tabernacle, the Holy of Holies, where since Moses can't get in order for God to speak to Moses, Moses is going to have to get in some way. There's going to have to be a way in which the enclosed God, to put it that way, is going to be able to speak to Moses. So from inside the Holy of Holies, God calls Moses, and then he speaks to him. Okay? So this once again underlines divine autonomy, God's freedom. Moses can't just go and have a conversation with God without God initiating the conversation. So everything in the book of Leviticus is a result of God's initiative, and therefore God's directing the action. So all the sacrifices, the kinds of sacrifices we're about to read, come from God to Moses, which didn't have to be the case had God not gotten out of his enclosure, we might say. So, and notice, by the way, those of you who have a Hebrew, that the aleph at the end of Vayikra is a small letter. And this is one of many examples of different pictures, I might say, in the Torah. We have a lot of things. We have the enlarged Bet, the first word of the Bible. Bereshit is enlarged. When God, at the end of chapter 2 of Genesis, there's a small aleph in the word, I think, Behibaram, in their having been created. Why don't we just, for the fun of it, go back there? Chapter 2, chapter 1, let's see. Yes, Genesis 2, verse 4. So the verse in Genesis 2:4 is, such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created. It's the end of the first creation story, in the middle of verse 4. You'll notice in your Bibles that after the first half of verse 4, there's a space. Because the editor is acknowledging that we have a different unit starting in what we might call chapter 2, verse 4b, the second half of verse 4. And the last word is Behibaram. Such is the story of heaven and earth when they were created, is one word in Hebrew. Okay, Hebrew has the idea of combining prefixes and suffixes to a word. Okay, what is 4 words in the English? Behibaram features a small hey, the word hey. Now, in Rabbinic Hebrew, hey is one of the names of God. You represent God by the word hey. So one of the ideas here in this small letter might be in their having been created by God, the emphasis on God. But also, Behibaram is an anagram for Abraham. And that's just Hibaram, Aleph, Bet, Avraham. Yeah, the ba is in, so you take the prefix off. Hibaram is an anagram. It has the letters of Abraham's name, which might be taken to mean, now we're just speculating, that already in the creation story, we have an anticipation of God's calling Abraham. There is a kind of teleological understanding of the unfolding of the Bible, that it's going somewhere. And where it's going, according to this interpretation from the very start, is the arrival of Abraham. Okay? So this is another example of small letter. We have the large letter of the Bet and so on. So one of the meanings, back to Leviticus chapter 1, of the small letter, by the way, before I say something about it, any thoughts, any midrashim, any ways of understanding that small aleph? If we, look, could just be an accident. Somebody wrote it a scribe wrote it in a small way, and such is the sanctity of the text, the next copyist deployed the small aleph, and it became the norm. It's always possible that this is an accident. Somebody once said about the book of Ecclesiastes that had not some sages included it in the Bible, it probably never would have gotten there, because it's a very problematic book. Once somebody calls it holy, it's holy forever. You get it enclosed in the text. Had the book of Acts, during the period of the creation of the Bible, had somebody stumbled one fine day during a walk on a scroll with the book of Ecclesiastes, would that person have said this is a holy book? It's very pessimistic, very cynical. The last couple of verses are probably tacked on in order to preserve it for Scripture. So there is something about the accidents of writing and transmission that create the possibility of holiness, whereas outside that process, we might not have thought so. Any ideas about the small aleph? Ron?
Is there a difference in the meaning of the word with and without
Yeah.
the small aleph.
Now, I think kara, kuf, resh, hey, means to happen or to happen by chance. That's an interesting observation.
And you can say it's veyakar.
Right.
If you take all
Right. So it might be that the small aleph, though if I were doing it, I would make it a very large aleph, is a way of saying this is not happening by chance. It's happening by a call from God. So that's an interesting idea. The small letter makes that speculation a little more fragile, but nevertheless it may point to the importance of the aleph.
Well, you have the same thing in Leviticus.
But Leviticus, what do you mean by that?
Well, is there a difference in the meaning of the Hebrew word as presented without the aleph and as presented with the aleph?
Oh, they have two different meanings. One means to happen by chance. The other means he called. And that's very different. And that's the name of the book as well. We don't know it as Leviticus except through the Latin tradition. One interpretation of the small aleph is that it's a sign of Moses' humility. God called Moses, and Moses recognizes for all his prominence that he really is a messenger of God. He really is subordinate to God. And therefore, the fact that he is called is not a gesture of elevating Moses to a certain even divine status, but to indicate that Moses himself is merely a vessel for the call of God. That's one interpretation of it. There are others, I'm sure. Rabbi Dadun last night in her Devar Torah said, and I think this is also interesting in the same vein as the interpretation I just gave, that it is a warning to individuals that we need to make ourselves small enough to make room for others, and therefore to make room for community. It's a warning to us not allow our egos to dominate our understanding of who we are. We're fundamentally members of a community, and therefore each individual needs to mute, to diminish his or her own ego expressions. I like that as well. She was making a case for the priority, the prominence of community. Scott?
Is there any possibility that it has to do with, if you were speaking it with emphasis?
With emphasis?
Where it would be less emphasis for that, and thereby giving more emphasis to something before or after?
Okay, so Scott's idea
Well,
is...
just asking.
I'm sorry?
I'm just asking.
No, yeah. Well, I mean, how do I know what the answer is? That your idea is that it reduces the importance of this particular moment in order to give greater prominence to what follows. Here, this is about Moses. And what is Moses about? Bringing the various ideas of sacrifice so that the community can function as a community. That's what's important, not Moses. Is your guess, a guess? Yeah, good. I mean, Midrash, we know this, Midrash is conjectural. It takes a problem, some issue in the text itself, whether it's semantic or whether it's in terms of spelling, the letters themselves, a problem is noticed and a solution is sought for. Okay? We have a problem here, why the small aleph, and we search around for interpretations. And even though we don't know, some of these interpretations may be seen as illuminating. The notion that Moses is a vessel, a vehicle, an instrument, and not just because God called him doesn't mean now it's all about him. The idea of humility and so on. Okay, so let's read. The Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when any of you presents an offering of cattle to the Lord, as he shall choose his offering. He shall choose his offering from the herd or from the flock. So the word to present an offering comes from the Hebrew root karav, kufresh bet, which means to come near, to approach. In the causal form, to make to come near, and it's a certain form of Hebrew language called a hifil, it means to bring near, so that the sacrifices here are represented as gestures, actions, which bring us near to God through the bringing near of a sacrifice. Okay? So this is a way of intimacy with God, according to this understanding. So when any of you presents an offering, ki yakriv mikem, karban, which is from the same root, a karban is that which is brought near, namely a sacrifice. Karban ladonai, a bringing near to God. He shall choose his offering from the herd or from the flock. If his offering is a burnt offering, an olah comes from the root ayin lamed he, which means to lift up. If you bring a lifting up sacrifice, now let me interrupt myself and say the following. The first 5 chapters of Leviticus represent 5 different sacrifices. Okay? The first is the olah, the animal burnt offering. And its being lifted up means that it has no continuous application in the life of the community. Nothing is taken back from this offering. It is burnt to a crisp. So its being lifted up is its essence. The second chapter deals with a parallel offering, but there it is a meal offering, a handful of dough or grain. This is, we might say, a poor person's analog to the olah, to the burnt offering. How many can afford an animal, to sacrifice an animal? If you can't sacrifice, if you have no animal to sacrifice, or your animals are so important to you as the creator of your nourishment, are you out of luck? Are you not able to participate in the ritual? No, you're not out of luck. There is another way of doing the same thing, and that is a grain offering. The third chapter deals with the zevach shalamim, the sacrifice of greeting or well-being. This offering is offered to God, but something is taken back as food for the priests. Okay? So what we find here is different kinds of offerings for different kinds of purposes. After all, the priests need to be able to make a living. And they make a living from the zevach shlamim, from the offering of the peace offering, the offering of well-being, because they get their food from that. So you can see that we have an interesting, we might even call it, in a maybe highfalutin way, a sort of philosophy or sociology of sacrifice. It's not just we have 3 different kinds of sacrifices. We have 3 different kinds of sacrifices, each of which carries a meaning in the life of the community. An animal, grain, something for the priests. Chapters 4 and 5 deal with what you do when you've committed some kind of a sin, a guilt offering, a sin offering, and so on. So this is, chapters 4 and 5, offerings of remediation. Okay? So the first 5 chapters give us a kind of, let me use a big word here, a kind of typology of modes of sacrifice, different purposes and different methods. And in this regard, I do want to read something that the Jewish Publication Society, Leviticus, which is written by Baruch Levine. We always feature Nachum Sarna, who did the first 2 volumes, Genesis and Exodus, and now we have another author. So what I want to read is, if I can find it, yeah. It should be emphasized here, as the workings of the sacrificial system are introduced to the reader, that the laws of the Torah did not permit Israelites to expiate intentional or premeditated offenses by means of sacrifice. If I commit a crime, sacrifices don't end the matter. Okay? There was no vicarious ritual remedy, by which we mean substitution of one's property or wealth for such violations. If I rob a bank, I can't make a sacrifice of a lamb, and the lamb now takes the place, the idea of substitution of me, and therefore I have atoned for my sin. The sacrifices do not do that. There was no vicarious ritual remedy, substitution of one's property or wealth for such violations, whether they were perpetrated against other individuals or against God himself. This whole idea of vicarious atonement is central to Christianity. God suffers, Christ suffers for our sins, takes our sins on him, and therefore redeems us from original sin. And since we are descendants of Adam and Eve, we are born into sin. The idea of original sin, I think, is better understood as inherited sin. What Adam did now affects all of us because Adam changed through sin the nature of being human. And our sin is so great that we can find no way to neutralize it. And we need someone, a pure someone, to offer himself as a sacrifice, as a substitution for our sins, and therefore redeeming us from sin. And therefore I think that Levine's paragraph here, though he doesn't say so, makes a very powerful point about the difference between Judaism and Christianity. That's a big statement. But something like that in terms of this particular idea. There was no vicarious ritual remedy, substitution of one's property or wealth, for such violations, whether they were perpetrated against other individuals, against God himself. In those cases, the law dealt directly with the offender, imposing real punishments and acting to prevent recurrences. The entire expiatory system ordained in the Torah must be understood in this light. Ritual expiation was restricted to situations where a reasonable doubt existed as to the willfulness of the offense. Even then, restitution was always required where loss or injury to another person had occurred. Okay, so if I did something involuntarily or there was some doubt about it, a sacrifice would help me, but still I have to pay the person whose cow I stole. The mistaken notion that ritual worship could atone for criminality or intentional religious desecration was persistently attacked by the prophets of Israel, who considered it a major threat to the entire covenantal relationship between God and Israel. That's a lovely, powerful paragraph, isn't it? Which does explain a great deal. Okay, so what we have here, therefore, in the first 5 chapters of Leviticus, which is repeated in chapters 6 and 7, from the point of view of the priests, In chapters 1 through 5, it's from the point of view of the sacrifice. 6 and 7 repeats it from the point of view of what the priests need to do. By the way, the book of Leviticus is known to the rabbis as Torah Kohanim, the Torah of the priests. And one can understand this in two ways. The Torah, the teaching of the priests for us, or the teaching of the priests for the priests. So chapters 1 through 5 is Torah Kohanim, the teaching to the priests for the people. Chapter 6 and 7 is the teaching of the priests for the priests, a manual of priestly behavior. You can see that Torah Kohanim is ambiguous and can contain both. Malcolm?
I didn't have my hand up.
Oh, you didn't?
I was thinking of something. But, so I don't know how you knew that. I appreciate your calling on me.
Call on Malcolm. He doesn't have anything to say, but when you call on him, he will.
Is it possible to conceive that, but for the golden calf episode, the book of Leviticus would be unnecessary? In other words, we proved ourselves to be, just like in the Garden of Eden, unable to follow some basic instructions. Moses was all prepared to give us some clear instructions. We couldn't wait. We took matters into our own hands. And God says, well, if that's the way this people is going to be, I need to, and the 10 Commandments won't suffice. I need the whole book of Leviticus to tell these people what they should, must do and must not do.
So, I think you're raising an excellent point, and it's a nice transition to our Maimonides, Nachmanides. I know you didn't mean that, but it occurred to me when you were saying it. Because your question really is, how deep is the need for law and for sacrifice? Is it rooted in something that is eternal, that is ontological, part of reality, or does it have some other function? I don't know that I'd go so far. No, I'm not going to say that. Good. So, that's a nice blend. Let's look at our sheet here, Maimonides and Nachmanides. I'm glad I paid attention to the heavenly voice. Call on Malcolm. Very good. Oh, boy. I was just reading something actually earlier this morning on, of all things, the opera Carmen, and which we're going to see in Chicago next or later this week, something like that. Turns out that one of the greatest Carmens in history, who sang Carmen many, many times during the lifetime of Bizet, in one performance began to she picked up one of the tarot cards which indicated that she was going to die that night. And she began to feel very, very bad about it, and she began to have pains, and they stopped the performance and so on. Bizet died that day. So this is my connection about calling on Malcolm, right? Was this a premonition? Was this a message sent to this soprano, which she experienced through some pains in her abdomen, that something bad was going to happen to Bizet that night? So, another Twilight Zone moment. Okay, so let's look at Maimonides here.
Who was the singer?
I'm sorry?
Who was the soprano?
I can't remember her name. So this is from his Guide for the Perplexed, or Guide of the Perplexed. You can see at the top, part 3, chapter 32. I'm just pausing, wondering whether I should read what's on the first page. I've started on the second page. Let me try it. Let me start this from the beginning, because I think it's relevant. So Maimonides says here, if you consider the divine actions, the deity's wily graciousness and wisdom. So this is a very important notion for Maimonides, that God sometimes acts in ways that don't make sense to us, but can be understood to making sense. He makes a distinction between God's first intention and God's second intention, where the second intention takes the place of the first, but leads to the first. So the deity's wily graciousness and wisdom, as shown in the creation of living beings, in the gradation of the motions of the limbs, and the proximity of some of the latter to others, will through them, this notion will become clear to you. Similarly, his wisdom and wily graciousness is shown in the gradual succession of the various states of the whole individual. In other words, the idea here is, we might ask, why is the process of maturation, physical maturation, take so long a time? Why can't we be fully mature much earlier? Because God is preparing us gradually for the kinds of activities we're going to engage in. The brain, for example, and so on. Similarly, the deity made a wily and gracious arrangement with regard to all individuals of living beings that suck. When born, such individuals are extremely soft and cannot feed on dry food. Accordingly, breasts were prepared for them so that they should produce milk with a view to their receiving humid food, which is similar to the composition of their bodies, until their limbs gradually and little by little became dry and solid. God recognized that even though meat and wine is wonderful food and drink, it would be preposterous to feed infants that, because the infants are not in any position to digest it. So God recognized that there needs to be a kind of nourishment consistent with the softness, the undevelopment of the newborn, and therefore provided breasts so that human beings, babies, could suck. Many of the things he goes on to say in our law are due to something similar to this very governance, God seen as governing the world, to this very governance on the part of him who governs. May he be glorified and exalted. Now we're on our page. For a sudden transition from one opposite to another is impossible. He's talking about human nature. We don't make big transitions in an instant. And therefore, man, according to his nature, is not capable of abandoning suddenly all to which he was accustomed. And therefore, God sent Moses, our master, to make out of us a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are all quotes, right? Through the knowledge of him may he be exalted, accordingly to what he has explained, saying, unto thee it was shown that thou mightest know, and so on. Know this day, knowledge, and lay it to heart, and so on, so that we should devote ourselves to God's worship according to what he said, and to serve him with all your heart. And you shall serve the Lord your God, and him shall you serve. This is a little mysterious. Here's what Maimonides means. God's ultimate goal for human beings, that we should know God and that we should serve God with all our hearts. That's the final goal. And him you shall serve. I just finished where footnote 9 is. And as that time, that is when we were in Egypt, as at that time the way of life generally accepted and customary in the whole world, and the universal service upon which we were brought up, consisted in offering various species of living beings in the temples in which the images were set up, in worshiping the latter, and in burning incense before them. In other words, we at that period were like all other peoples who worship their God through sacrifices. That's what we were accustomed to. The pious ones and the ascetics, being at that time, as we have explained, the people who were devoted to the service of the temples consecrated to the stars, God's wisdom, may he be exalted, and his gracious ruse got in a way as fooling us, which is manifest in regard to all his creatures, did not require that he give us a law prescribing the rejection, the abandonment, the abolition of all these kinds of worship. In other words, God's ultimate goal is to know God, to worship God with all our heart. What do sacrifices have to do with that? Inherently nothing. Why did God do it? Well, God recognized in God's cleverness that we were used to in Egypt, as were all the peoples of that time, to offer sacrifices. So, for one, I'm in the underlined parts, for one could not then conceive of the acceptance of such a law, considering the nature of human beings. In other words, God is a profound student of human nature. How we might be willing to act or not willing, which always likes that to which it is accustomed. At that time, this would have been similar to the appearance of a prophet in these times, in our day, in the 12th century, who, calling upon the people to worship God, would say, God has given you a law forbidding you to pray to him, to fast, to call upon him for help in misfortune. Your worship should consist solely in meditation without any works at all. In other words, the sacrifices are instruments for the furtherance of God's final plan. Okay? Therefore, he, may he be exalted, suffered the above-mentioned kinds of worship to remain, but transferred them from created or imaginary and unreal things to God's own name, may be exalted, commanding us to practice them with regard to him. In other words, what move has been made? God, according to Maimonides, has no need for sacrifices. Sacrifices have no inherent value. They're only instruments to get us to worship the right thing in the right way. In the right thing, in the right way are two steps. In the right thing comes later. In the right way means merely to shift the object of sacrifice from idols to God. God has no interest in sacrifices. They have no inherent value. It's merely a pedagogical device through gradualousness to wean us from sacrifices to the real worship of God. Okay? And therefore, God tolerated sacrifices in order to get us to take the first step, to sacrifice to the right deity. Okay? Now notice that Maimonides does something very interesting. He says it would be the same thing as if a prophet today said, don't have any worship services. Don't offer any prayers and so on. The prophet would come. God has given you a law forbidding you to pray, to fast, to call upon him for help in misfortune. During what period of history do we do that? Now. So if you think of God's tolerance of sacrifices as long as it's to the right person, those sacrifices is only a provisional step on the road to a perfect step. By analogy, what we do today is not itself the ultimate way of worshiping God, but merely an understanding of human nature that needs these props in order to be able to do what we want to do. But ultimately, we shouldn't be using a prayer book or prayers at all. It's only a penultimate step to something higher. Thus, I'm down here right above the footnote 10. You see it over there at the end of a line. He commanded us to build a temple for him, and let them make me a sanctuary, to have an altar for his name, an altar of earth you shall make unto me, to have sacrifices offered up to him. When any of you brings an offering, to bow down and worship, to burn before him. And he forbade the performance of any of these actions with a view to something else. Okay? So fundamentally, Maimonides believes that's the whole sacrificial worship is itself without any inherent value. This relates, Malcolm, to your question. What is the point of all this Leviticus? And Maimonides' view is it's a necessary vehicle to get us to do, it's a ladder on which we climb to try to reach a higher point. And once we've reached the higher point, we can kick the ladder away. Okay? Scott?
So, sometimes it amazes me that he wasn't burned as a heretic.
Right.
That's a really radical notion, even for today. But, I mean, it bucks the tradition, the authority. All right, but that's not the point. This is sort of an extension then of the idea you proposed last week, that God was evolving, was changing through time and learning as well as we were. And this would be a step along the way of that evolution. Yeah.
I think Maimonides, talk about burning. I think Maimonides would suggest that maybe you yourself, that God is changing. See, for Maimonides, God has no biography. God is not changing. Maimonides is not really so interested, I think I'm right to say this, in the dynamics of a covenantal relationship. God, in a way, for Maimonides, very much Aristotle's God, though Maimonides' God does give commandments, that God is there as a kind of example of perfection. And our role is to try to climb the ladder to God's perfection. God has no needs. God is not involved in interactions. So I think that Maimonides would very much reject. God is an object of knowledge and of love. And if you want to ask why, the idea of perfection calls us to it. Our vocation as life is the yearning for perfection. Here Maimonides is very much a Platonist and an Aristotelian, that God is static, and that the role the goal in life is to create a yearning, an eros, a love for perfection. Okay? Now let's look at Nachmanides at the very bottom of the page. This approach, I don't think this is a quotation, a quote of Nachmanides, but a discussion of Nachmanides. This approach, which resonates with modern people, still raises some questions. First, as a traditional Jew who believed in the eternal bindingness of the mitzvot, how could Rambam, Maimonides, suggest that sacrifices had outlived their purpose? See, what Maimonides is really suggesting is that during the times of the first and second temple, when sacrifices were central to the ritual life of the people, okay, it was serving its purpose as an instrument. When the temple was destroyed, what are we to hope for? Not the rebuilding of the temple, but the turn from sacrificial worship to verbal worship, to prayer book, to rabbinic Judaism, okay? And therefore, there will come a time, according to Maimonides, when the sacrifices not only can't be enacted, but ought not to be enacted, okay? Nachmanides is saying, how could Rambam suggest that sacrifices had outlived their purpose? If he did not believe that they would continue to be binding in the future, why did he write all the laws of sacrifices in his Mishnah Torah? Nice point. And I think Maimonides' response to that, however inadequate, was that his role in writing the Mishnah Torah was to summarize Jewish law and not to make distinctions between the valid and the not valid. And doesn't this take away from the concept of the perfection of the Torah? God didn't mean it. The whole book of Leviticus is really a ruse. It's a way of, in a sense, fooling us to believe that these commandments to sacrifice really have ultimate significance. And we better believe that, or we're not going to engage in sacrifices. And if we don't engage in sacrifices, we're not going to be weaned from our idolatry in order to recognize that they're merely stepping stones. And doesn't this take away from the concept of the perfection of the Torah? How perfect can the Torah be if the central book of the 5 books of Moses is a ruse? Back of the page. Rambam himself answers the latter question, saying that God doesn't change the nature of people, and a perfect Torah is one that is perfectly suited for the realities of where people are. That's the perfection of the Torah, a deep understanding of human nature and human need. Sometimes, says Rambam, we have to consider where the mitzvot are pointing us. That's why all those quotes in the beginning of the page, know God with all your heart. What's the goal of the sacrifices? Not to mollify God through animals, but to get us to begin to understand the ways of God. Sometimes, as Rambam, we have to consider where the mitzvot are pointing us, rather than seeing them as describing an ideal final state. This is quite provocative, and we have discussed it in great length elsewhere. Ramban, in his commentary to the Torah, Vayikra chapter 1, verse 9, so this is the comment on verse 9 of the chapter we began to read, takes great issue with Rambam's approach, and besides arguing the specifics and bringing proof texts to contradict Rambam, argues against the idea that sacrifice is so central to worship in the Torah and already practiced by Adam and Noah should not have intrinsic value. I mean, why does a text give so much attention and time and space to sacrifices, not just in Leviticus and parts of Numbers, but already way back at the beginning with with Adam and with Noah and so on, bringing sacrifices? Is all this just a ruse? He states that the significance of the sacrifices can be understood as symbolic and psychological, and sees the sin offering as the primary sacrifice. Accordingly, he states that when a person sees the animal slaughtered, the blood thrown on the altar, and the entrails burned up, he reflects and takes to heart the greatness of his sin, and how he has sinned both in thought and deed, and how he deserves to die. The intrinsic value of sacrifices as a way to clear up our proclivity to sin. It's not that they're mere instruments for something else, They deal with a real problem in life. We might say a Freudian problem. How do we get rid of our guilt? How do we get rid of the sense of the wrongfulness that we engage in? Don't we need to be liberated from guilt so that we can move on in our lives? That's what sacrifices do. They're not merely vehicles. They deal with real problems. This is Nachmanides' view. Ramban also gives a Kabbalistic explanation, seeming to indicate that the sacrifices have theurgic, that is instrumental, ritual, and metaphysical impact on God's relationship to the world. So not only do the sacrifices, according to Nachmanides, go far beyond Maimonides' view in dealing actually with real problems, they have an impact on God. You see, for Maimonides, we don't impact on perfection. What can we do for perfection? For Nachmanides, as a Kabbalist, God needs us. So let me just say something about the Kabbalah, about which I know very, very little. So the Kabbalah has this notion of the catastrophe that happened in the creation of the world. The world order was upset by the creation of the world, and the shards of light were sent out from God and captured by klipot, by husks. And the goal of human action, the goal of the commandments, is to liberate these isolated moments of light and reunite them with God. Creation of the world was a catastrophe for God, that God is alienated from God's self. And therefore, God is on a journey as well. Think about a Jewish peasant in 12th century Mainz who works hard all day in the fields and goes home at night and says Kiddush and makes motzi. What is he doing? He's not just enacting a prayer for the sake of sanctifying the Sabbath. These mitzvot, which this anonymous peasant is engaged in, is helping to reunify God's essence. The commandments have an impact on God. The commandments have a metaphysical, ontological meaning. They're not just customs and ceremonies. They're not just community organizations. They have something to do with helping God. You remember Heschel's really a magnum opus, which is God in Search of Man. That's that idea. Heschel was raised in a Kabbalistic, or at least a Hasidic environment. God needs human beings, is this idea. And so for Nachmanides, not only do commandments, the basic idea is that commandments have an intrinsic value. They're not merely instruments for the sake of weaning us from the need for sacrifices. Sacrifices are always important. Would Maimonides look forward to and hope for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem? No, that would be regressive. Of course not. We've come to a much higher stage. Would Nachmanides want the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem? You better believe it, because without the temple, we cannot have authorized sacrifices, and therefore cannot do the work that sacrifices do. Unless we can sacrifice again, God is going to be estranged from God's self, and the psychological value of sacrifices cannot be attained. For Nachmanides, the destruction of the temple, the sacrificial altar, is a world catastrophe. For Maimonides, it's just the next step in the development of human life. So Nachmanides deploys this Kabbalistic understanding to, in his words, to refute Maimonides. So then Malcolm asked the question, what's the value of all these laws? I don't know that you asked yourself sacrifices per se, but I think Maimonides would say they're all part of a ladder to help us climb high. And after we get to the roof, we don't need it anymore. Whereas Nachmanides would say, the problem with Maimonides is that the Torah really is not a perfect document. It doesn't really deal with the needs of human nature, or actually with God's needs. But for Nachmanides, he takes with great seriousness what the Torah is saying about the mitzvot. So I think for Nachmanides, the golden calf may have exacerbated the situation. Well, you know what Nachmanides says, that the golden calf is precisely in the right place. For Rashi, the building of the tabernacle is an atonement for the golden calf, and therefore should come after. For Rashi, chapter 32, the golden calf, should be followed by chapters 25 to 31, the building of the Mishkan. The purpose of the Mishkan is to atone for the golden calf. That's Rashi. For Nachmanides, the building of the tabernacle is merely one more step in the search for the perfection of human life. And therefore, it will always be valid inherently and not just to solve a particular problem. Any thoughts about all this, Gary?
So would you say that the current Hasidic movement is a continuation of the approach of Nachmanides? And
A very much later approach.
right, but it is a continuation of his concept. Whereas perhaps the Reform movement is perhaps more in the ways of Rashi.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point. I would say much more Maimonidean than Nachmanidean, so I'm going to try to remember to repeat the questions. So Gary asked whether or not the Reform movement, I've rephrased your question, is more Maimonidean or Nachmanidean. Nachmanidean is also Kabbalistic / Hasidism. Gershom Scholem calls Hasidism normal mysticism. It's not engaged in all of this speculation, which I've just described a little bit. It's much more about the emotional life of the worshiper as a way of achieving what is called dveikut, intimacy with God. I think that, the Orthodox are much more Nachmanidean. These laws will never lose their salience or importance, whereas I think that the Reform movement really is a product of the 19th century. And one of the key ideas in the 19th century was the idea of history, of development. Think of evolutionary theory or Hegel's philosophy of history and so on. And therefore, the Reform movement is wedded to the notion of progress, that we can outgrow some of the activities of our ancestors. Why is it that we have always been devoted to kashrut? Not because kashrut is inherently valuable, it's instrumental during a time when the mixing of Jews and non-Jews was dangerous for Jews, and when non-Jews didn't want to engage in relationships with Jews. Having laws of food limited who you could eat with. You couldn't go next door to your Gentile neighbor. And therefore, the laws of kashrut have no inherent validity. They have instrumental validity. And once the situation changes, so can the ways in which we have acted. Once we are introduced into and become a part of non-Jewish society, we don't want to be isolated anymore. We want to go next door to our neighbors and have a meal with them and to drink their wine. So that, and this is progress, the progress of reason and science, which has allowed us to take a more universalist stance and unify humanity. So kashrut is very, very regressive, whereas a Nachmanidean would say, but look at all the impact in an ongoing way that kashrut, the laws of kashrut have. So I think it's a very good point. Candy?
Do you think about these things when you decide not to take the Torah out of the ark on Friday night?
What things? What things?
This ladder and a progression of maybe of intimacy with God not being furthered by taking the Torah out of the ark. If intimacy with God is the ultimate goal, is that correct?
Oh
All
gosh.
this is like really new to me, and I'm trying to put it together.
What are you trying to put together? Why we don't
Well,
take the
I'm trying to
Torah
find
out
out what
of
the ultimate goal is, for one thing, and then I'm wondering why we don't deal more with meditation and less with verbal prayer and repetition. But then I got to the idea of the representation of the Torah, which, I really miss not having
you and a
being
lot of
taken
people?
out. But that does seem sort of regressive in
That seems
reaching
regressive,
the
yeah.
ultimate goal. So I'm wondering how you decide to move the congregation or the people that you shepherd, if that's correct.
Well,
toward the ultimate goal.
So-
And if you actually consider these things when you make these decisions.
Do we consider these big, big ideas when we make these decisions? In our dreams, yes.
Well, how else are we going to get there, though?
Look, I mean, the premises behind your questions themselves need to be scrutinized. I mean, what is the ultimate goal? And what are the means by which we achieve the ultimate goal? And what is the role in taking the Torah out to achieve whatever we think the goal is? I mean, all these things need to be clarified. I would say in a more simple way that there are many ways in which we try to attain some of our goals. The creation, the stabilizing, the deepening of community, celebration, meditation. I think none of these requires taking the Torah out of the ark. This doesn't mean that I'm not for taking the Torah out of the ark, but I don't think, however we define the goals, that taking the Torah out of the ark is essential to it. Yes, we do think about these things, and I know there's a lot of concern that we are not taking the Torah out of the ark. I mean, that, I think, is maybe the fundamental point of your point, that we ought to be able to enjoy having the Torah out, and I agree with that. We're at a particular period here where a lot of things are going on, and it's hard to deal with everything. I think it's a very powerful question. What is the goal of worship? What is the goal of coming together for a Kabbalat Shabbat service? And I think it's multiple. And I doubt that we could agree on the hierarchy of goals. I think we might list 4 or 5 goals, but I think we would disagree on what the highest goal is and so on. So that's why there's a variety of services and so on. Yeah, Patty?
I'd invite Candy to come next week because I haven't been talking much because we're still talking about Leviticus and rituals. I get chapters 6 through 8, and the ideas we talked about today seem to be more about the nature of God and our relationship to that, like what does God expect of us? he did of Aaron's sons, or like what is God's true desire for us. And next week, kind of flip it into human nature and really what is our need for ritual, and in a cynical sense,
And a what thing?
positive sense. From a cynical perspective,
From a cynical perspective on our needs?
right, and how ritual has more stratified society, and specifically how these laws have set up different layers, and that also is reflected in other cultures. And on a more individual basis, how ritual can be very beneficial in bringing us closer to God, or our idea of something supernatural or bigger than us, and how that kind of prayerful position is a healthy way of looking at even sacrifice, even giving to other people of ourselves or something that's important to us can lead to happiness. I have some studies to talk about.
I'm going to cancel my trip and come next week.
I'll be on live stream.
I could laugh. Will you repeat the questions? Sounds interesting. Okay, other comments? Yes.
I get stuck in understanding in the arc of this why a people didn't take certain opportunities to move forward. Because we're talking about here's a problem, here's a solution, and structurally you sort of change your methodology of living your life, you move forward more toward God. So why the rejection of a portion of the Jewish community against the idea of a final sacrifice, of a final release from the tethers of the really old ways, and that final release being symbolically done through the body of Jesus. And
Right.
then you can go, okay, we're done with that. Now we can move forward. And Jesus says, I bring you a new commandment. And that new commandment is that you love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, and your neighbor as yourself. That is the platform then to continue the evolution. Why not embrace that?
Which is found in the book of Leviticus. It's right there in the scriptures of the Jewish people. Why focus on something final? Why think that there is a final answer to the human dilemma? But human beings continue to try to grow. The problem with the notion for me of final is captured for me in a kind of image. And I've talked about this before. I think the typical Christian view, I mean, I don't speak for Christianity, and Christianity is many things, but this whole notion of needing some kind of final gesture suggests that we don't have the wherewithal to solve our own problems. As if human beings find themselves down a deep, dark hole without a ladder on which to climb out of that problem. And therefore, we need help. We need somebody, miraculously, to take us out of that hole. The Jewish tradition, based upon the Bible, feels that God's world, the world that God created, contains all the elements that we human beings need in order to flourish. We don't need a vicarious atonement or somebody like Superman to come and help us with our dilemma. We have an orderly world, a world that is subject to reason, understanding, technology. We have minds and hearts with which to deal with our problems. We have personal resources. And we have a Torah, not necessarily the Torah, but the whole tradition of trying to understand the meaning of our lives in and through the study of this document and all that follows, including the worship service, which quotes Torah consistently, so that You know, if I'm trying out for a baseball team and I want to be a shortstop, I'd better work very hard with the attributes that I've been given in order to be the best version of the shortstop I can be. What isn't going to help me is going home and praying that somebody deliver perfection for me. That's not how we do it. We do it in the optimistic sense that we have been provided everything we need in order to reach for perfection. I think the Christian view is fundamentally pessimistic about human nature and our capacity to solve our own problems. So the rhetorical move about needing a final answer already begs the question, why bring final into it?
Just a brief rebuttal. So if you take the golden calf as a place marker, and then Moses comes in and makes a change of the way things go on. If that's completely accepted, that the calf is the old way, now there's a new commandment. Couldn't there be other places?
The calf isn't the old way. The calf is a story about human proclivities, tendencies, that we want to have something visible, tangible. And this is just a recognition of the dilemmas, the problems that confront human beings on the way to trying to live the best lives that we can. So it's not itself so final a sense of human incapacity, but just that human beings, as the rabbis tell us, have a Yetzer Tov and a Yetzer Hara. We have two different inclinations, and I use the metaphor of a rubber band. A rubber band is not by definition stretched. A rubber band is stretchable, so that the evil inclination, it has no ontological, metaphysical reality, something that must be the case, that we have evil as a part of us. We have a tendency to do bad things, but we have the freedom to get ourselves out of the tendency to do the wrong thing, toward the tendency to do the right thing. Everything is in our hands, God having made the world that now beckons us. And for the Jewish people, this is the way life is. And it's not a matter of finding the final redemption. One can talk about the Messiah. There is a messianic idea in Judaism, but the Jewish Messiah is very different from the Christian Messiah. The Christian Messiah saves our souls from sin, and himself is perfect. The Jewish Messiah is another human being who will be known through his works of bringing peace and justice to the world, and who will die. The Messiah is only the Son of God in the sense in which we all are children of God, and in no special way. So, there you have it. Vivian.
Oh, no, I'm not, see?
I'm calling on Vivian and Malcolm today without their...
Oh, that's so weird, and I was only going to, see, you're reading my mind, but not, I had no
I'm getting it
answer.
from...
Just the way you bring in music, I cannot help, and I can't show this, I was going to just bring this to you, but there is this magnificent painting in the Contemporary Gallery it's called The Scroll. It's a contemporary, it's 1978, Canadian author. It's enormous, it's black, and you can read it two ways. You can read it any other way as you want, but it is a Torah staring at you.
Where is it?
It's in our CMA.
It's in the,
Yes.
and who's the artist?
The artist, okay, you can look him up and make your own mind. Now that you've made me tell you this this little black space on my phone. It is, the name of the artist is Guston, Philip Guston. He is Canadian.
Gutson.
Yes. And the painting, it's the whole
Like
wall.
a table.
Oh, yeah, it's much bigger, it's enormous, it's overwhelmingly black. You approach it in black, but the Torah stands along an arc.
Yeah.
And the only other color in the painting is red.
Okay.
And of course, the first instinct when you look at it, oh my God, Holocaust. It stands, in fact, against in counterpoint to the wall of Kiefer. It is the Holocaust. But you can also read it as creation, as Genesis. This is not blood red, it may be light. And the arc of the line is the creation of the world, and the Torah stands on it. And I mean, I'm not trying to give you an art lecture here, but looking at it, not hearing about it.
What's the name of the painting?
It's called Scroll.
Scroll. Interesting.
And it is overwhelming also. The paint is vibrant and lit. It has its own gloss. So there's light emanating in this blackness. So it's a very, anyway, I find that our discussion
Good.
really hit me as a painting this morning.
This is down at the Art Museum.
It is at the Art Museum.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you
My
for
little
introducing
pitch
us.
for contemporary art, Gallery 229.
Okay. Vivian is pointing to a painting that is down at the Art Museum in Gallery 229.
229.
Oh, boy. Michael?
Okay.
I was wondering if since we're bringing art, should we bring in baseball here?
Never.
I noticed you saw that the manager of Cleveland, Guardians, said if you want to play baseball here, you got to play it the way we play the game. Now, of course, our Cleveland manager is not going to live forever. There'll be a new manager. So the question here is, we're always going to have to try to be perfecting our rituals.
Yeah.
Whether they be how to be a shortstop, or whether how to be a priest, or how to be a good member of or a worshiper.
Right.
And so all these questions, I think I've occasionally here mentioned the book that was so influential on me, the anthropologist, Ritual and Religion in the Making of Humanity, that Roy Rappaport's conclusion was, if we change ritual too quickly, religion will die. So the ultimate goal is, how do we perfect the relationship between people and God? Okay, if we change rituals too quickly, religions will die. If we change rituals too slowly, rituals will die.
Right.
And so the question is, how quickly or how slowly do we change rituals over time in order to maintain and perfect the relationship of people with God?
Yeah.
Would that be a way of looking at it?
Well, yes, but the crucial question is up for grabs. What is slow and what is quick?
Yes.
Yeah. And I think some of that just has to do with pressures from below. Are there things in the environment? Are there things in what people say that alert us to the need for some reflection, reconsideration, and change? Right, right. Okay, folks. Well, here we are. Next week, Patty. Shabbat Shalom.
That is too funny. I didn't mean to.
Sorry?
I said that's too funny that you called on me just because I was.
Yeah, right.
You were relating to my eyes, I guess. I was like.
Oh, I think something, maybe your gesture.
There was something. But the other thing that in the discussion that occurs to me, because I always go back, it's the literature in me. I always go back. The perfection it is contradiction. It's in its story. It's still a story.
Christians and Jews are exactly the
Well, I
same.
mean, what makes you,
Well,
you're
except
saying
that
that the Torah
Christianity
is the
allowed
story
a larger community
No, it's a
because they were reaching out to these for the
the depth of philosophy, theology, our rituals being interested also. And skipped over meditation. But my mind wants to go to meditation. Where's the Jewish meditation? Except in studying it.
Right, and he doesn't mean meditation in the sense of being quiet and thinking. He means thinking.
Thinking, which is reading and rereading and rewriting and editing. Yeah.
I like the point. I
No.
You're just describing what we try to do here. Yeah. Okay.
That's it. I mean, so that was what was noodling in my head. Caught a gesture maybe. I don't know why.
Well, these are two great thinkers. My mind is in that.
So what language did they write? Did they write it?
He wrote in Arabic. But I always said to my audience, that was the lingua franca of the day.
Translations of these words.
Of my mother's words,
You still have to watch it.
Then they came there and they did it.
Joy, Carmen, you're going to, you're taking a week for yourself.
we need our friends and my colleagues. Maybe it's more of us. You want to be Jackie and she you.
Yes. And also, we'll get back to the
Well, except that.
They are. They're getting,
limitations out.
they've lost a key person.
They're different, yes. Reluctantly.
I can see that you are.
I didn't mean to do this, but I'm in it, so, but
What's a great organization? But they,
delighted and thrilled to be part of it.
So if it's a problem, but I know I'm sure.
So, it doesn't matter. I heard we're trying to smell it and record it. And so, of course.
But in a sense, it doesn't matter.
oh, good, all right, because I haven't gotten tickets yet, so should I just say, sitting with you guys?
Yes, we will, I think we have to.
I don't think the number.
You have two tickets. Okay, you want me to just go ahead and do that, or you want to see what the process?
Whatever it is.
Oh, okay.
So we'll figure it out, we'll figure it out. Yeah.
And it turns out to figure out.
No, I'm not gonna turn out to do that.
Good.
There's no way, not you. It was to figure out everybody else.
Good, I'll indicate that when I get
Okay.
We're sitting at your table.
Tables, yes, there should be 2 Henoch tables. Our son is purchasing one, we are, but we're 12 people, so whatever, we'll get it.
For each table.
We'll get it, we'll figure it. I'm not gonna trouble you with the numbers, but
Okay.
people right now, too much. But I know the backstory,
I did too a little bit. I play tennis with Noah, you know.
oh, of course, yes, she's engaged us in the other project. Yes, we've had a couple meetings with Noha.
She's great.
They're all great.
Yeah, they
So, thank you.
Okay, good, thanks, Vivian.
And the idea of the tradition, and you mentioned that there's multiple that one of them has to be certain, you said no. Aware of this presentation. I never heard anybody I don't see a value other than that. It's just an enjoyable here's how we are the you're aligning.
Wait a minute.
Well, I thought maybe you guys would try to.
Oh, you mean to take care of things? Yes, it does. Yeah, they're
Probably gonna be
That's what I'm thinking of. For 9 or 10 years, they're on the plane.
So I thought you were
They don't.
addressing those on red line.
I also don't, do you think it matters?
No, there's one other thing
Yeah, I know.
about the sacrifice.
First of all, I can control
It's a way of
what I'm gonna do for 8 weeks. And I think it's all people.
Well, it says, now they're suddenly aware of the seriousness.
I write it
So,
down.
to me, it's sort of a reminder, and perhaps, that is some
We should also consider the thing that it's on the back.
It's because it's still, it may not be intentional, but it's still skill. I think what this describes, the way it's written here, he states that when the person
It's June 15th, so it would be April 15th.
it takes the hard degrees of this.
Yes, so we're talking about April 15th or April 16th. We're talking about 1 week, it doesn't make any difference.
Reminding them that, this was a bad thing you did.
That's right.
Which is not necessarily a bad thing, I'm not saying it's a bad thing.
Yes, the problem is Pesach is in the way, and it's all and it's the week of the 5th of April until
It does.
it's that weekend.
So you're going beyond
the
the
temple so
If that happens in your head, like, well, no, I think I can see your.
Yeah. And everybody was, and the other thing is free, Everything is
That's what I just thought. That's an interesting thought.
And maybe the role of Jesus is to do it for us even before
The letters.
reduces the human journey.
the temple. He doesn't know whether
The letters
it's
that we
Debbie.
studied.
So do you know who Debbie did it? Debbie.
I've heard Daddy say the same thing.
She has the,
But it's also,
I mean, the text of it remains basically the same. They change, maybe they don't but other than
And I
that.
looked at the book and the page changed.
Yeah.
and you know, I just never know.
I was always in that.
To Debbie.
Oh,
Okay, so part of this, you know, is holiday, that life is not makes this
I know it's in
It is.
So it doesn't,
we prefer in a way that we have and has one of the contract when asked that question. I know it's in it.
but it's all I that's what I said.
We don't know.
A friend of mine, I went out and I met her once.
Wow.
So, anyway, she got teaching.
That's right. That's right.
Actually, 8 weeks now, and there's a terrible, terrible tragedy. But she and I used to debates about the two things.
That's right. That's what it's meaning.
We were trying to change each other's minds, we were trying to make each other aware of our perspectives. And I told her, I said, you know,
I don't know that that's what I
Is
have.
that happening?
I don't know either, but,
he's the guy who was the
I mean, the
master
only thing is, why would that have even been mentioned
of
if
someone
we're talking about just collaborating?
why do you worthless rags?
I mean, that's,
It's
I have,
because
Thing that for
no,
people that
no one knows, right?
right,
No one, and I don't know that we are. Do you want to discuss that?
Are from the university.
Maybe I don't know.
You know, law schools make
much
them
better.
effective.
Every day, I can do something the day before. Yesterday, I reached up and turned on the garage door without thinking, and I went, oh, I couldn't do that yesterday. So the little thing, we just tiny. He thought I was in month 3 of recovery, and I'm a day away from month 2.
Doing
No,
everything.
I have a
Yeah.
friend,
That's why you're.
I have a friend who sent me a picture of her. And I said, where did you get it? And then I forgot about it. She told me, no, she told me online, and then I didn't know where we were.
But he thought that I was in month 3. Same early. Yeah.
Yeah, you have to order those, you have to go online. All schools now have online shopping, so that you can order your. That's
Oh,
She pushes me quite hard.
that's what you need.
Yeah.
For me to say.
No, you're right, though. The other day, she was doing this thing that was a special day. She just kept talking, and I wanted to give her feedback and say, listen, I finally got a word in, I said, that's, you know, that's really uncomfortable. She said, I know, that's why I'm talking and trying to distract you. So, very good.
Is she present to you?
Yes.
You're there. You go.
Yeah, but I didn't know, but now I know. I was
Jewish
reminded
from
that.
Montreal.
Go online,
oh, I want to see that. I read a previous book, you know, on
store.
But they're not
They
kidding.
must have a,
But they're not, they're a little college, they're a little college.
it's a smaller school.
It's
I've got an
a
easy
small
one.
school.
And ours.
Yeah,
well, I don't know.
couple thousand at the most.
But I think, you know,
Yeah, I don't
Exactly.
know that
And
they-
it's like I went to,
My granddaughter
Exodus
went to
25.
and that's tiny.
Exodus 25.
Yeah, so I went to school in Binghamton, Harvard College is what it was called.
Oh, yeah, I remember heard about it.
Right, and I bet they don't have it.
Well, we're gonna,
But maybe, they